Today, my client is having three 22-inch Burmese curly bundles from my raw collection installed for her sew-in today. My client does want all three of her bundles installed, so the first two will be doubled and the last one will be single. I doubled the first two because I want to get as much hair into the head as possible, but keep in mind that depending on how thick, how healthy your client's hair is, it is important to advise them on what you think is best before just trying to install all of the hair in, because sometimes it could be too much for the client and too much for their hair. In my client's case, her hair is very healthy and her hair can withstand holding three bundles. When you double the weft, that just means that you keep the weft folded. At the open end of the weft that's folded, I'm going to stick my needle through just to bond those wefts together. And this will help me have a little bit more security, give me more control of the weft as I start to install it and attach it to the first braid. I threaded my needle pretty long because it helps prevent me from stopping so much to have to redo it. But if you are a beginner or a person who needs more practice, it's okay to have it shorter just so that you can have more control over threading, because it can get tangled and that can be frustrating. So as you can see, I threaded into the weft a few times and then did a knot just to make sure that it's on there pretty good. And now I'm going to start by threading underneath that first braid close to my client's ear. For this very first threading, I'm going to do a double lock stitch method. Holding the weft close to the braid, you're going to push the needle under the braid and the weft. As it's coming through from under the braid, you're going to stop midway enough so that the needle is out to catch the thread, and then pull from the thread that's at the other end of the needle. Wrap it around the top end of the needle twice and then pull it through. This is going to create a double knot. Because this is the start of your foundation, you can double lock right here as many times as you need to, but once you're comfortable, you can move along and proceed to do the single stitch method, which is just going under the weft and the braid, pulling it through the middle, and keep going. Now, I go back and forth between doing a double lock or a single lock. It just depends on how much security I feel that the weft needs in the moment that I'm threading. Most times, if you're moving pretty quick, what you could do is single lock when you're in the middle of the head, and as you approach the sides or each end of the client's head, that's when you can do the double lock for extra security. I'm approaching the opposite end of my client's head, so now I'm going to show you guys how I do my flip over method. The simplest way to do this and guarantee that your client's hair will be flat is to leave the top weft behind and continue on with the bottom weft, because when you go back to curve to the opposite end, you're going to pick up that top weft and keep going. You may come across different flip over techniques where some people flip over both wefts at the same time. I do this method because not all wefts are created the same and some wefts are thicker than others. So you may find that it's very difficult to flip over wefts that are super thick, and it might not create the flattest foundation for your client. So now that we've reached the end of this side, I just flip the weft over. Now we're going to sew back to the opposite side of my client's head. When you start, you're going to go underneath the braid, the weft at the bottom, and the part that you just flipped over. And again, I'm using the double lock stitch method for this. Notice how I'm keeping these stitches close and I'm using the net as extra security because I do want to sew over in this area a few times before moving along. As you sew back, don't forget to pick up that weft that we left behind. This is how you'll keep the hair doubled without creating too much bulkiness. As I approach the other end of my client's head, I'm going to do the same thing as I did before. We're going to leave behind the top track, and then we're going to keep sewing the bottom track along to the very end. This will help eliminate any bulkiness when we go to flip the tracks over. Again, as I mentioned before, sometimes when you try to flip both tracks at the same time, it'll create too much bulkiness, especially if the wefts are very thick. In this case, my raw hair extensions, the wefts are always very thin, so I don't have any complications when I flip over both wefts at the same time. But for the sake of this video, this tutorial, and also considering people that may be beginners or still need some practice, I wanted to show you guys this method. When I approach the end of my client's head, sometimes I triple knot the thread just to add an extra layer of security when knotting. And then when I continue to thread, I like to stitch close together at the end. And then as I start going more over to the opposite side, I spread my stitches out just a little bit more. Stitching them close together at the end just ensures that when you flip it over, you're making it flat. So you can honestly do that as many times as you need to until you feel like it's flat enough to your liking. We're reaching the end of my thread, so I don't want it to get too small because it'll be difficult to tie a knot. So I cut it at the tip of the needle, and then you'll see me tie a knot twice. You can do it twice, 3 times, 4 times, again, as many times as you need to make sure that this doesn't come loose. You'll then pick up a new needle with thread or rethread the needle that you just did and just pick up where you left off. Continue sewing to the opposite end of your client's head, but don't forget to pick up that bottom track that we left behind. I continue to repeat the same steps until this bundle is complete. Right now will be a good opportunity to pause the video if you like to practice what's been demonstrated, or you can continue watching. The second bundle will be doubled as well, but this time we're starting to curve the hair. Curving the bundles will allow the hair to fall towards your client's face. When the hair falls in your client's face, it helps their leave out to blend better. It's also good to do this when your client has a receding hairline, a thinning hairline, so this will allow the wefts to cover those imperfections. After sewing downward along the weft, we're going to start curving it to go across the back of the client's head. But when you do this, you want to make sure that the tracks aren't laying directly on top of the wefts that are underneath this bundle. This will help eliminate any bulkiness, any overlapping, anything that won't look natural. Same thing as before, as we reach the opposite end of our client's head, we're leaving behind that top row of the weft. Continuing on with the bottom row, we're still going to curve up and then we're going to pick it back up as we come back to it. So you're probably wondering, why did we start this bundle with both wefts when we curved it on the opposite end? To me, it's just easier to start that way and then continue the leave behind method once we get to the opposite side, because it's harder to try to start it single and then double it along the way. It's not necessarily harder, but again, I'm trying to make this beginner friendly so it's not difficult for anybody trying to learn how to do a sew-in. Another thing that I would like to point out, as you get higher in the head, where you decide to leave the track behind will be behind the ear. You'll use your client's ear as a guide, so once you start to approach the opposite side, as you get closer to the ear, that's where you'll leave behind that top row, continue on to the very end of your client's head, and then flip it over, come back and pick it back up. This will guarantee that you leave any type of bulkiness and heaviness towards the back of your client's head. We want to make sure our client's hair is full and that we can put as much hair into their head as possible, or that they would prefer. But we also want to make sure that when they're pulling their hair back or go to put their hair behind their ear, it's not too bulky or too heavy for them. It looks natural. I have reached the opposite side of my client's head, and like I did on the opposite side, I curved the bundle up, and now I'm curving it back down to meet that track that we left behind. I'm going to repeat this same method until we reach the end of this bundle. Your installation should look something similar like this once you're complete. Because I had more hair left on the opposite side, I was able to curve the hair up a little bit more. The size of your client's head and how much hair is being used will determine how the outcome will look at the end. So don't beat yourself up if it doesn't look too identical to what's been shown. We're almost done, so hang in there. We're doing the last bundle, and this time it's going to be single. I choose to do the bundle single because I don't want to have to worry about flipping over two tracks at the same time. I want to eliminate as much bulkiness or too much fullness at the top. So I don't worry too much about trying to fit this whole bundle in if it doesn't work, because again, we're going for a natural look. We don't want a helmet head, and we don't want their sew-in to grow out and look crazy. I do want to mention that I don't cut my bundles. I haven't cut the first bundle or the second bundle, and I don't plan on cutting the bundle at the top unless I necessarily have to. So that's another reason why I only do it single, just because I'm going to flip it and I don't want to have too much bulkiness or difficulty when flipping it. So if you didn't catch the note that I dropped a couple seconds ago, I'm starting this weft curve because we ended the last weft on the opposite side curved. This will be the last time that we'll curve the wefts as we go up the sides. From here, we'll just go from side to side and just flip the wefts directly over top of each other. When you're doing a middle part install, you always want to make sure whatever you're doing on one side, you're doing on the other side, so that the hair always falls the same on both sides when you go to style your client's hair. So we're approaching the opposite end of my client's head. We're still going to apply everything that we've been taught so far. So when you reach the end, you want to make sure you still sew close together. And then when you flip the weft over each other, you're going to still sew underneath both wefts to secure it down in place. And then you're going to just continue on with that top weft. As we approach the very end of this install, this is going to be one of those times where we actually cut the weft, and it's because we don't want to do a flip over when we sew the last row. I'm going to show you guys how much is left over before I complete the last row, just so you can have an idea of how much space to leave in between the row you just sewed and then the last row. Now I will say that I probably could have got one more row in, but because we are running out of hair, I'm going to just complete this install. So as a stylist, I will say that sometimes you have to make an executive decision on how to go about finishing your install, no matter what you're taught, or no matter what you see, because sometimes your client may not have enough hair, or they may have too much hair. You just have to really do it as you see fit. Now, my client's hair is very full and very dark, so even though she has some space in between the previous weft we installed and this last one, you're not going to see it as much when we go to style it. I do want to encourage all of my students watching this video to always just have open communication about what's happening with your install. If you're running out of hair or if there's gaps within your client's install, just let them know and be aware of what's happening and what they can do at home when they go to style it, because you never want your client to go home with surprises and then they're communicating that frustration to you, and then you're having to go back and solve the issue again, because I've ran into that type of incident before, and it's very frustrating. So you always just want to have open communication, be honest up front so that your client understands, and most of the time they take that information well, especially because they know that you're being honest with them. So I hope that helps you and give you some encouragement, and also lets you know that you're not alone. I always want to be transparent with my students and let them know that I do still run into people who have complications. Every client does not have a perfect set of hair. You know, people have issues. So as long as you have open communication, you talk through with your client with what's happening, you can build that relationship with you where they trust you and respect you and keep them coming back, because that's what's important.